U.S. car buyers had to go through some challenging times in the early 1980s, as many cars were pretty unexciting and lacked significant power and panache of earlier vehicles that customers were driving around and were trading in during this time. However, by 1984, a little bit of excitement came back into the U.S. market. Heck, even a Corvette was offered in this model year, while it was not for the 1983 model year. A couple cars that customers could choose from were the General Motors X cars during this time period, of which we just did a feature on a 1984 Oldsmobile Omega Brougham. And I thought it was appropriate to compare the Oldsmobile Omega Brougham versus what would have been a Japanese competitor during the time period that customers could have bought. That is the Honda Accord for 1984. More specifically, it was really during this period of the 1980s the customers started eschewing domestic vehicles and looking for alternatives. Honda was arguably the darling of the Japanese competitors and at the forefront of what many deem to be vehicle innovation as well as reliability. Yes, there was, of course, Toyota during this time period, but it was Honda that captured 2 spots on Car and Driver's 10 Best list in 1984 at a time when Toyota did not have a single car on the list. And as I mentioned, during this time period, Honda was really the Japanese car company to beat. So let's talk about the 1984 Honda Accord and juxtapose it against that 1984 Oldsmobile Omega Brougham that you can see my review of on my channel. The first thing to note about these two vehicles, the Omega and the Honda Accord, is that they both had about the same base price. And that base price was around $8,000. So the Honda was not priced up against the Citation. It was priced up against a more expensive X car like the Omega. And basically, these two vehicles cost the same price in the showroom from a base price perspective, and you could load both of them up with various goodies that most people wanted, everything from automatic transmissions to power windows, power locks, etc. The Olds physically was a bit larger car with a 105-inch wheelbase and 181-inch overall length compared to the Honda Accord's diminutive, by today's standards, 96.5-inch wheelbase and 175 inches in overall length. So the Accord was about 6 inches shorter in overall length than the Omega, and it had about an 8.5-inch shorter wheelbase. This allowed the Accord to weigh in at just 2,300 pounds, 2,271 to be exact, whereas the Omega was pushing 2,550-ish pounds in curb weight. Imagine those curb weights today. You just don't see vehicles that are that light in any size class, really because of safety standards more than anything. But 2,271 pounds for the Accord is super lightweight, and that endowed it with a number of advantages. Let's talk more about the pros and cons of both these vehicles from a new perspective, as well as a used perspective of even today. When it comes to the 1984 Accord, there were a number of pros, and it may surprise people and viewers of this channel that I have actually driven a number of these cars, and I've even owned 80s era Hondas. I had a 1985 Honda CRX hatchback for a number of years, which was a wonderful car in many respects, but I do no longer own it, and some of that experience will go into this review of the Accord because they had similar engines, albeit the Accord had a 1.8-liter four-cylinder, 12-valve four-cylinder that made 86 horsepower and 99 pound-feet of torque. If you compare that with the X cars, the base engine in the 1984 Omega was a 92 horsepower Iron Duke four-cylinder that made 134 pound-feet of torque at just 2,800 RPM. So the torquiness in the X cars of the engine was much better. You can accelerate away from a stoplight in the Olds Omega, I would say, much easier than the Honda, particularly if the Honda is equipped with an automatic transmission versus the manual transmission. But on the engine side, the Accord did have something that was a big leg up on the Omega, and that is overall engine smoothness, and I would just say powertrain smoothness in general. Anybody who's driven one of these 1980s era Hondas just falls in love with the engines and how smooth they are, how beautiful they sound. To say that they sound like little sewing machines is perfectly accurate, and they make great noises for a four-cylinder. I have driven a number of these 1984 Accords, and it's almost as though as the tachometer goes northward, you don't feel any additional vibrations from the engine. And that just isn't true in the X car's base four-cylinder engine powertrain, where the Iron Duke is crude is the best adjective to describe it. So it's no wonder why people really fell in love with the Accord from a drivability standpoint. The engine is just a little sweetheart. And moreover, the transmissions that Honda offered were more advanced, and the manual transmission in particular, significantly better than anything else offered in the marketplace. Anybody who's driven a Honda 5-speed manual of this period knows that it's still, frankly, a benchmark transmission, even by modern-day standards. I have never driven a modern car with gearboxes that are as smooth as the 1980s era Hondas. You can go in and out of a gear with just one finger. They are an absolute delight to drive. And it's not totally clear how Honda did this in my mind, but they did even have things such as their own manual transmission fluid, and maybe that was something that helped. But the transmissions in the Honda are more advanced. They came with a 4-speed automatic optional, the 5-speed manual standard. The Omega had a 4-speed manual and a standard and a 3-speed automatic optional. And again, the overall engine smoothness and the transmission smoothness, particularly the manual transmission, just far exceeded that of the Omega. However, as I mentioned, you did have to really rev that 1.8-liter four-cylinder because of the low torque at higher RPMs compared to the Omega. And also the Omega had an optional V6. So there were some benefits to the Omega, and the V6 actually was quite pleasant in the X cars. The next pro, I would say, from an overall perspective on the Accord is just the drivability and the handling prowess that these cars had. The Accord in 1984 had full four-wheel independent suspension, and the steering had a beautiful lithe feel to it. It was really an enthusiast car to drive, and it did make, as I mentioned, Car and Driver's 10 Best list for 1984. And I think Car and Driver's David E. Davis Jr. summed it up very well when he said that the Accord is the car that American and German car makers are most apt to have in mind when they shake their heads and wonder how the Japanese can pack so much product content into their cars and how they finish them with such extraordinary quality. If you sat in one for the first time, stripped of all its identification, you'd believe someone who told you it was a small Cadillac. You wouldn't believe the same of a Cimarron. And that was definitely a true statement for these Accords. So we've talked about a number of the pros of the Accord, namely its overall drivability and fun-to-drive factor. Well, what were the cons of it? And actually, they were myriad, although they didn't show up necessarily when the customer first bought the car. But over time, these cons definitely manifested themselves. And that started with a number of things. First was the head gaskets in this 1.8-liter four-cylinder, which was true of all the Honda engines at that time. They tended to blow head gaskets, particularly if you overheated them, and that was a very, very expensive repair. That was not something that typically happened on the X cars. There were some individuals who had head gasket issues, but it was a far less frequent occurrence. They also had very complicated carburetors and vacuum systems under hood, extremely complicated and expensive parts to service. If you bought a part for one of these 1984 Honda Accords, whether it was an exhaust system part like a muffler or a carburetor or anything else under hood, often the cost was double or more of the replacement cost of the domestic vehicle part. So that was not something that endeared them to their customers. Maybe not the first customer, but the second or third customer. I can also say that the Accord on the inside really suffers in one area quite notably versus the X car, and that is interior noise. The X cars are quite quiet inside to drive at speed, whether that's on the freeway or around town, and I just can't say the same of the Accord. Noise was not something that Honda really concentrated on, and consequently, at freeway speeds, 70, 80 miles an hour, these cars are actually really noisy to drive and are wearing on the driver because they are so noisy. The sheet metal was paper thin on these Honda Accords, and people often talk about the X cars rusting, but to be truthful, the Japanese cars also rusted even faster than their domestic counterparts. You almost breathed on the Accord and it turned to rust. And consequently, because of that paper-thin sheet metal, that really endowed the car with a higher level of ambient noise overall. I would also say the brakes, interesting, we're talking about brakes being a challenge from the Accord compared to the X car. In the X car, it was really the proportioning and the rear wheel lockup. On the Honda, it was more the brake rotors and pulsations. They would heat up and deform and distort and create a less than pleasant experience. Of course, this is something that you can replace quite easily as opposed to having to bring back to the dealer multiple times to fix something that was at least partially incurable. And I mentioned overall the service expenditures were something that was not a great attribute for the Accord. They had more expensive service parts. They also had more expensive, I would say, service procedures, including on these 4 cylinders, a timing belt that needed replacement. There was no such timing belt on domestic vehicles of this era, and that was something that customers had to pay more for. Lastly, from an interior perspective, I would say that the Accord had world-class ergonomics and front seat comfort, great seating, great roominess overall, but because of the relatively short overall length, the rear seat comfort in the Accord wasn't the same as it was in the X cars, and they were a bit tight, only 32 inches of legroom in the rear, which is a couple inches less than what was found in the X cars. So not great overall interior roominess if you wanted to fit your family in the car, especially compared to the X car. So that's really a summary of some of the pros and cons of the Accord. So overall, the Accord was just a very rewarding car to drive, at least around town. Maybe not on long trips because of, as I mentioned, the ambient noise in the interior. But the engine and transmissions in the Accord were just little sweethearts to drive when they were new. As they aged, Honda's carburation, as well as the sea of vacuum hoses under hood and solenoids, created some serviceability issues, and the serviceability expense was certainly higher on the Accord than the X car. The interior space wasn't quite as great as in the Omega and the X cars, and the overall comfort maybe wasn't quite the same, I would say, between them. I think the comfort of the X car was a little bit better, consequently because of the greater interior space than the Accord. And also, while people often say the Japanese cars of this period had better quality, and they did, in fact, have better quality, that doesn't mean the Honda was without its issues. Head gasket replacement is not a small issue, and it was a pretty frequent occurrence on these Hondas, as well as carburetor issues and rust, as I mentioned, while an issue for the X car was even more severe on the Accord. I would also say that while the Honda engine was definitely more of a sweetheart than the Omega engine, the torque rating in the Omega's Iron Duke 4-cylinder endowed it with much more zippability, if you will, around town. It just didn't feel all that much peppier because you hated to hear the Iron Duke operate. It just had more of a diesel John Deere-ish feel to it than the Accord, which felt like a Swiss watch was under hood. And the X cars also did have their share of reliability issues, most notably the braking and the steering racks, which would develop morning sickness and make it hard to turn left and right in the early morning hours in particular. That said, which of these cars would I pick to own today? Well, I would say that it depends on what you're trying to do with the car. If you want something that is just fun to zip around town and enjoy, kind of a car that even by today's standards is quite fun to drive, then I would pick the Accord. If you're looking for a car that's more of a freeway car and a cruiser that you want to take on some longer trips and enjoy it, I would pick an X car and just get a later model X car, like a 1984, 1985 model by the time most of the quirks were fixed. I would also say that if you get an Accord, you need to make sure you can find somebody who can service it. So call around first before you buy the car to see if you can find anyone who will touch it, in particular the carburetor and underhood issues. Most mechanics these days don't even want to set foot and open the hood on one of these cars because they know it's a sea of vacuum hoses and it's really challenging to service. So that is the most important thing. You can still get the X cars pretty well serviced. By most garages will still touch it if they touch classic cars, but the Accord is a totally different story. In any case, hope you enjoyed this review of the 1984 Accord versus the Olds Omega. If you did, let me know. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, take care.